He was only 8 years old when his mother left him at a lonely gas station in Boise. With nothing but a torn backpack and a German shepherd who refused to leave his side, the boy vanished into the Sawtooth Mountains. Everyone in town warned him the wilderness would swallow him whole. But they were wrong, because when his loyal dog began barking at the rotten floorboards of an abandoned hunting cabin, they uncovered a hidden trap door. And beneath it lay a secret, preserved in the cold earth for years, one that would rewrite the story of a missing soldier and change the boy's fate forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Cold autumn rain whispered across the cracked asphalt of the Boise travel stop. A thin gray veil drifting beneath the fluorescent lights that hummed above the pumps like tired insects. And in that muted world stood 8-year-old Jack Carter, a small boy with wiry limbs, sandy brown hair plastered to his forehead, and hazel eyes too old for his age. He clutched a damp $10 bill so tightly the edges curled around his trembling fingers. His mother had pressed it into his palm just 2 hours earlier, or was it 3? Her voice too bright, too sweet, like someone performing happiness instead of feeling it. 20 minutes, Jack. I'll be right back. She'd said that with a smile that didn't reach her eyes that were pale and restless, always searching for exits, never settling on him long enough to give comfort. Jack replayed that moment endlessly now, as if rehearsing it might change the ending, as if the memory could be rewritten into something gentler. But the parking lot remained empty except for passing trucks sighing across wet concrete. He understood with brutal clarity that she wasn't coming back. He'd known this part of her long before his mind could arrange the right words for it. That way, she drifted through life like a leaf caught in currents she never learned to escape. Her decisions were sudden storms. Her promises were summer clouds. Jack loved her, but he had learned to live between her vanishings and returns, learned to pack fast, keep quiet, read moods. Now, staring at the reflections of taillights smearing across puddles, he felt a familiar hollowness swell inside him. But this time it was deeper, heavier, final. The cashier inside the one with a sagging ponytail and freckles and a tendency to chew gum with an anxious snap had been glancing at him with growing suspicion, her brows knitting together each time she saw him still standing alone by the window. Jack knew she would eventually call someone. Maybe the police, maybe child services, and the thought made his chest compress like a fist squeezing around his lungs. Foster homes, strangers, rules, separation. He could already picture it all, and fear dug its claws into him. He had to leave. Jack circled the edge of the convenience store, his small sneakers slapping softly against the wet pavement. His breath trembled in his chest, but his mind was sharper than fear allowed. He spotted the heavy metal emergency door behind the building, the red letters declaring, "Do not enter, alarms, danger," all the things adults took seriously. But adults weren't here for him. Adults had abandoned him before. Adults would abandon him again. He pushed the bar, wincing, as a high-pitched alarm shrieked into the rain, brighter and louder than anything his heart could handle. But he ran because running was all he knew when life thinned beneath his feet. He slipped into the shadowed gap between dumpsters and the back wall of a fast food restaurant, the air thick with the smell of grease, wet, cardboard, and yesterday's fries. He crouched there, trying to silence the pounding inside him, waiting for shouting or footsteps. None came. The alarm faded. The world swallowed the sound like nothing had happened. It was then he heard the soft rustle beside him, a muffled scrabble of paws on wet earth. Jack froze. He turned slowly, expecting a raccoon or stray cat, but what emerged from beneath the crooked lip of a dumpster made his breath catch. A German shepherd, gaunt enough that his ribs created sharp ridges beneath his dark, rain-soaked coat, crept toward him on cautious paws. The dog's fur was a deep, rough brown with black saddle markings, and one ear, the left one, was torn along the edge, giving him a battle-worn appearance. His eyes, though, were the part Jack couldn't look away from, dark intelligent, wary, but filled with something that looked dangerously like understanding. The dog sniffed the air between them, lowering his head, but not in fear, more like recognition. Jack whispered, his voice so small it nearly drowned in the rain. "Hey, boy, it's okay." The words trembled out of him, fragile and hopeful. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the only food he had left from earlier that day, a half-squashed hamburger bun he'd saved without knowing why. Hunger was familiar, but loneliness was worse. He held out the peace arm extended, hand still shaking. The German shepherd edged forward, each step measured and deliberate, as though testing Jack the same way Jack was testing him. When the dog finally took the bread gently between his teeth, Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This creature, thin and weary, seemed carved from the same ache he felt. Both left behind, both lost, both searching. The dog sat beside him, not close enough to touch, but not far enough to ignore. Jack studied him with quiet awe. The animal must have been around 3 or 4 years old, but exhaustion aged him. His paws were muddy, his fur clumped from rain, but beneath that rugged exterior was strength, a body built for running, guarding, surviving. Jack wiped his face with the back of his wrist, smearing rain and tears into a single indistinguishable streak. "I guess it's just us," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. He had never spoken truer words. The dog tilted his head, and for a moment something almost like humor flickered in his dark eyes, as if he knew this skinny, abandoned boy was claiming him and he didn't mind. Jack thought of all the names he'd ever liked, names from books, from stories his mother read before everything fell apart. But the one that came to him now seemed to rise from the dog himself. "Shadow," Jack said softly, "you look like a shadow that never leaves." The German shepherd blinked, huffed a quiet breath, and rested his chin briefly on Jack's knee, sealing the unspoken pact between them. The rain grew colder, but Jack felt warmer with the dog beside him. He listened to the faint hum of traffic, the distant sputter of a neon sign flickering on and off, as though the world were nodding off for the night and leaving him behind in its half-dreaming dusk. But now he wasn't entirely alone. He leaned back against the brick wall, Shadow curling beside him with a slow, wary sigh. Jack's mind churned through fear and sadness, but beneath that was a quiet ember of determination. If his mother wasn't coming back, then he would find his own way, even if that way led into places unknown. Adults had failed him. Fate had forgotten him. But Shadow had chosen him. That mattered. That anchored him. Together they would slip away from the parking lot, away from the fluorescent lights and pitying stares. They would look for shelter, for food, for a path forward. And even though Jack wasn't sure where that path would lead, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would rather face storms, hunger, and the unknown wilderness with Shadow by his side than step into the bright, sterile safety of the world that would claim him as a lost child. He was lost, yes, but he was not alone. Not anymore. And that night, huddled beneath a steel sky, Jack Carter made the only decision he felt he could live with. He would run. He would hide. He would survive. And with Shadow walking beside him, he would disappear into the edges of the world before anyone could pull him back. The first step into that dark stretch of wet gravel felt like stepping into a new life, frightening but strangely free. The boy abandoned at a gas station was gone. What remained was something raw, determined, and quietly fierce, a child who now carried loyalty at his side in the shape of a German shepherd with a torn ear and a survivor's heart. The morning after the rain-soaked night behind the restaurant felt heavier than Jack Carter expected. Dawn had barely risen, only a thin stripe of pale gold stretching over the edge of the Boise skyline, and the air smelled of wet earth and old asphalt. Jack tightened the frayed straps of his small backpack, more a child's school bag than anything meant for surviving the world, and glanced down at the German shepherd now glued to his side. Shadow's fur, still damp, clung to his ribs, and his sharp, alert ears twitched at every sound beyond the dumpsters. The dog walked with a quiet confidence that Jack lacked, but desperately needed, and something inside his chest warmed at the thought that Shadow wasn't leaving him. Not today. Not ever, Jack hoped. He didn't know where they were going yet, only that they had to go. Staying anywhere near the gas station meant adults would eventually find him, question him, take him into custody, and send him somewhere he couldn't take Shadow. That thought alone drove fear deeper into his spine than the cold air ever could. They slipped between back alleys and storage yards, keeping to shadows, following the rusted chain-link fences, until they were far from the bright lights and watching eyes. Each step felt like peeling himself away from the last remnants of the life he knew. But Jack pushed forward, telling himself the same sentence over and over. "You're not alone. You have Shadow." It was enough. By mid-morning, they reached the edge of a small industrial strip where trucks rumbled in and out of a worn parking lot. Jack and Shadow crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets, listening to the low voices of two truckers drinking coffee near the back of a semi. One of the men, short, wide-shouldered, wearing an old denim jacket, talked about the cabins up in Sawtooth and how nobody checks them anymore. Jack didn't see their faces clearly, only silhouettes shifting through the steam of their breath, but the words burned into his mind. Cabins. Nobody checks them. Safe, maybe. Hidden, definitely. He didn't know exactly where the Sawtooth Mountains were, but he recognized the name. It was on Idaho postcards his mother used to mail when she disappeared for a few weeks at a time. Pretty mountains, she'd say, in the rare moments she tried to be tender. Now they seemed less like a postcard and more like a plan. Shadow growled softly, a deep, low rumble vibrating through his chest as a tall stranger walked past them. The man had a shaved head, a thick neck and arms tattooed with swirling patterns. He looked rough, the kind of adult Jack instinctively avoided. Shadow's posture stiffened, making him appear larger despite his thinness, and Jack pressed a hand gently against the dog's shoulder. "Easy," he whispered. But the man didn't even glance their way. He disappeared through a metal door with a slam, leaving Jack with a racing heart and a stronger resolve. The mountains were the only direction that didn't point back to trouble. They followed the faint hum of the highway until the landscape changed, from concrete to patches of yellow grass and shrubby trees. Trucks thundered past them, their reflections flashing across the metal guardrails. Jack walked behind Shadow, letting the dog take the lead. Shadow sniffed cautiously at every bush and broken branch, alert to danger that Jack couldn't see. He was everything Jack wasn't: strong, sure, unafraid, and yet strangely gentle when his shoulder brushed against Jack's knee as if checking he was still there. Hours passed. Hunger nagged at Jack's stomach, but he ignored it. He'd grown used to ignoring it. Hunger had always been part of his life. What he couldn't ignore was exhaustion creeping into his legs. When he finally slipped onto a fallen log near an abandoned rest area, Shadow sat beside him with a heavy sigh, leaning his warm flank into Jack, as though offering both comfort and weight to keep him grounded. Jack reached out and stroked the dog's coarse fur, brushing away flecks of mud. "You think we can make it?" he murmured. Shadow gave no answer except a slow blink, reassuring in its own silent way. That moment was interrupted by the distant sound of gravel crunching. Jack's body tensed, but Shadow only lifted his head in curiosity, not alarm. From behind a faded vending machine stepped an older man, late 60s maybe, walking with a slight limp that suggested an old injury. He wore a heavy flannel shirt tucked into work-worn jeans and had a square jaw covered in gray stubble. His face carried the kind of wrinkles that came not just from age, but from long years spent on the road, the kind of lines carved by wind-sun and more than a few disappointments. His eyes, though, were warm, soft brown, thoughtful, rather than sharp. This was Mr. Lewis, a retired truck driver who now traveled out of habit more than necessity. He had been a long-haul driver for over 40 years, until a trailer accident left his right knee permanently stiff. That injury ended his career, but didn't take away his wandering nature. He had the quiet patience of a man who had seen more states than he could count and more lonely roads than most people could imagine. He stopped a few paces from Jack and Shadow, raising his hand slightly in a harmless gesture. "Easy now. I'm not looking for trouble." His voice was rough gravel but kind at the edges. Shadow stood legs rigid protective. Jack swallowed hard but didn't run. Something in Mr. Lewis's posture told him the man wasn't the kind who shouted or grabbed. He looked like someone who would rather offer help than hurt. "You two look like you've had a rough night," the old man said, reaching into the paper bag he carried. Without stepping closer, he pulled out a wrapped sandwich still warm and placed it gently on the log beside Jack. "Turkey and cheese. Got it fresh. You should eat." Jack stared at it, his hunger roaring to life, but he kept his hand still waiting. Mr. Lewis chuckled softly. "Smart kid. You got good instincts. Here." He unwrapped the sandwich halfway and took a small bite himself before handing the rest to Jack. "See? Not poisoned." Jack's defenses cracked at that, and he finally accepted the food, tearing off a piece to give Shadow first. The dog ate quickly but without aggression, licking crumbs from Jack's palm. Mr. Lewis watched them with a faint smile. "German Shepherd, huh? Loyal kind. Hard life, though, from the looks of him." Jack nodded. "His name's Shadow. A good name," the old man replied. "Sticks close, I bet." Over the next few minutes, Mr. Lewis asked gentle, careful questions. Nothing invasive, nothing demanding. He seemed to understand when Jack dodged answers, filling in the blanks with years of intuition rather than pressure. Eventually, he opened his bag again and took out a small plastic box filled with bandages, antiseptic wipes, and a tiny flashlight. "I used to keep this for emergencies on the road," he said, placing it on the ground between them. "But I got a feeling you two need it more." Jack's fingers tightened around the box. "Why are you helping us?" Mr. Lewis let out a quiet sigh, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the mountains loomed, faint and blue. "Because I know what it's like to be on your own sooner than you should have been." His voice softened, a crack of old grief threading through it. "Had a son once, about your age. Lost him. Didn't get to help him when he needed it." He cleared his throat. "Maybe helping you helps me a little too." He opened his bag one last time and handed Jack 2 small packets of dried fruit and a folded piece of paper. "Head west. Follow the truck route out of town. Keep to the tree line. You'll hit the foothills sooner than you think. The Sawtooths are rough country, but they'll hide you better than any city." Then he reached out, resting a firm but gentle hand on Jack's shoulder. "Take care of yourself, kid, and take care of that dog. He's your family now." Jack wanted to say thank you, but the words tangled in his throat. Mr. Lewis simply nodded once, turned, and walked back to his truck, the limp in his right knee more pronounced with each step. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The gift he had given, a little food, a little gear, and something resembling hope, was more valuable to Jack than he would ever know. And with that, Jack and Shadow continued westward, the towering blue silhouette of the Sawtooth Mountains, waiting like a silent promise. The world behind them was full of abandonment and loss, but ahead lay wilderness freedom and perhaps a place where 2 forgotten souls could carve out something resembling a life. Together, they stepped into the unknown. The first breath of mountain winter drifted through the Sawtooth foothills like a warning, thin and sharp enough to sting Jack Carter's cheeks as he pushed deeper into the woods with Shadow padding silently at his side. Weeks had passed since they left Boise, weeks of skirting along tree lines, crossing small streams that bit at Jack's ankles with icy teeth, and sleeping beneath half-dead pines that offered little warmth but at least a sense of cover. Jack had grown leaner, but stronger, his legs accustomed to the constant walking, his hands rougher from scrambling over rocks and branches. Shadow, once gaunt, now carried himself with steadier footing as Jack shared every bite of food the old man Lewis had given them. The dog's coat had regained some shine, despite patches of mud clinging to it, and his dark eyes scanned the forest with the watchfulness of an animal who had spent too long relying on instinct to survive. They had walked through silence for days, save for the crunch of needles underfoot, until the forest shifted. The trees grew denser, their trunks thicker and older, some with moss crusting their sides like ancient scars. The ground turned soft beneath Jack's shoes as if the earth itself had been swallowing fallen leaves for decades. Shadow's tail flicked with alertness, the dog sniffing the air. Something in the wind had changed, less the smell of pine, more the faint trace of old wood and rusted metal. Jack followed Shadow's lead, pushing aside a curtain of overgrown branches until the shape revealed itself before him, a cabin. The structure hunched at the base of a rocky slope like a memory someone tried to bury but couldn't quite erase. Its walls were made of darkened logs swollen and warped by years of snow and rain. The roof sagged under its own weight, and a single metal chimney leaned like a drunken soldier abandoned after battle. The windows were clouded with grime, one cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The front door hung crookedly on rusty hinges. Jack stared at it in stunned silence. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't safe-looking. But it was shelter. Real shelter. A place with walls and a roof and possibly a floor that didn't soak water. His heart thudded harder than it had since the night he ran from Boise. Shadow trotted toward the door, nose twitching, tail raised with cautious eagerness. Jack swallowed hard and stepped forward, pushing the door gently. It groaned open, releasing a puff of stale, dusty air mixed with something earthy, mold maybe. He crinkled his nose but didn't step back. He'd slept beside dumpsters. This wasn't worse. Inside, faint light from a cracked window revealed a dim interior. Dust coated every surface, turning the room into a quiet time capsule. A wooden table slanted slightly to the right, one leg chewed by rodents. A shelf on the wall held 2 old tin cans and a glass jar without a lid. There was a stone fireplace filled with ash, long since gone cold. A ripped wool blanket lay tossed in one corner beside what looked like an abandoned boot missing its mate. Shadow circled the room, sniffing each corner, his claws clicking softly on the worn floorboards. At one point, he huffed sharply, startling a mouse that darted across the room and vanished through a crack. Jack let out a shaky laugh, a sound too small to echo. "Well," he whispered to Shadow, "this is ours now." But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The wind, leaking through the gaps between logs, was sharp enough to cut through his thin jacket. Winter was coming faster than he'd expected. If they stayed, he had to fix the place. If they didn't stay, he had nowhere else to go. He dropped his backpack and set to work. The hours slipped by as he dragged rotting planks to block the worst drafts, stuffed pine needles and scrap cloth into gaps in the walls, and swept away layer after layer of dirt using a broken broom handle and a bundle of branches tied with twine he found under the porch. Shadow watched him with tilted head, occasionally nudging a piece of wood toward him as if offering help. Jack smiled each time. It made him feel less like a child pretending to be strong and more like someone who could actually survive this. When he pushed the door shut against the deepening twilight, the cabin no longer looked like a ruin. It looked tired. Yes, weather-beaten, absolutely, but it looked lived in. It looked hopeful. Night came quickly, dragging a bitter cold with it. Jack and Shadow huddled near the fireplace, but without wood or matches, the hearth remained lifeless. Jack pulled his knees to his chest, rubbing his hands together until they stung, and Shadow curled against him, the dog's warmth seeping into Jack's bones. They drifted into a restless sleep, Jack waking every hour from dreams where icy fingers wrapped around him, Shadow waking with soft growls at the noises of the forest pressing against the cabin walls. By morning, gray clouds smothered the sky. Jack stepped outside to find the first flakes of snow drifting lazily through the air, melting on contact with the ground. His stomach twisted in fear. Snow meant cold. Cold meant danger. They had to gather wood, anything to keep warm. He scavenged fallen branches, some wet, some half-rotten, and dragged them to the cabin. Shadow followed closely, nose buried in the snow-dusted ground, occasionally lifting his head to shake off the flakes clinging to his muzzle. Jack tried to start a fire using 2 stones and the hope he could strike a spark like in the shows he used to watch, but reality proved harsher. His hands grew numb, and frustration pricked at his eyes like needles. When he finally sank to the floorboards in defeat, Shadow nuzzled his cheek, leaving a warm streak of breath on his cold skin. Jack pressed his forehead to Shadow's neck. "I can't do it," he whispered. "I'm trying, but I can't." Then he remembered the box Mr. Lewis had given him. With trembling fingers he dug through his backpack until he found it. Inside, wedged beneath a roll of bandages, was a battered pack of matches. Only one remained. One. He held it like something holy. He piled the driest branches he had and arranged the kindling with shaking hands. Then, with Shadow watching silently, Jack struck the match. The tiny flame flared to life briefly, beautifully, before steadying into a thin, fragile burn. Jack cupped his hands around it, guiding it toward the kindling. The fire caught slowly, reluctantly, until at last the cabin filled with the first warm glow either of them had felt in days. Jack and Shadow sat so close their bodies touched, watching the flames dance. Jack felt tears slip down his cheeks, tears he didn't bother wiping away. Relief, fear, gratitude, exhaustion. They all blurred together in that moment. They were alive. Barely, but alive. That night, as wind battered the walls and snow piled thick against the door, Jack felt the first real storm of winter descend upon them. The cabin shuddered in the gusts. Boards rattled. The old roof moaned. Jack's heart pounded. When a particularly violent gust roared against the walls, he realized the worst the cabin wouldn't hold. They would freeze if they stayed on the main floor. Shadow barked loudly at something, maybe the wind, maybe the fear in Jack's chest, and then scratched at a spot near the far wall. Jack followed him, brushing away debris until his fingers found a metal ring embedded in the floor. A hatch. A hidden one. He pulled the hinges stiff and screaming until the door lifted, revealing a narrow wooden ladder leading into darkness. The storm howled. Jack grabbed his backpack, whistled softly to Shadow, and together they descended into the small root cellar. It was cramped cold and smelled of damp earth, but the storm's rage was muffled here. Jack wrapped his arms around Shadow and lit the last burning ember from the dying fire above, feeding it into a small metal pan he found near the ladder. It was enough to warm the tiny space, enough to keep them from freezing. They slept, curled together, boy and dog, trembling, but alive. When morning finally arrived, the world above was silent. Jack climbed back up carefully, pushing open the hatch. Snow had blown through gaps in the walls, piling in small drifts on the floor. But something else caught his eye. In the corner of the cellar, tucked behind a stack of long-abandoned baskets, sat several sealed jars and tin cans, old dusty but intact. Food, real food, enough to last days, maybe weeks. Jack stared at them, breath caught in his throat. "Shadow," he whispered, voice cracking with disbelief. "We're going to be okay." In that forgotten cabin, beneath the weight of winter and the silence of the mountains, Jack Carter felt hope stretch warm fingers back into his life. The storm that nearly tore the forgotten cabin apart had passed, leaving behind a world muffled in white, as if the forest itself had been wrapped in silence. Jack Carter woke stiff and aching on the cellar floor, his cheek pressed to Shadow's thick fur. The German shepherd stirred first, lifting his head and shaking off dried mud and lingering fear before nudging Jack gently. Jack blinked awake, the remnants of cold clinging to his bones, and for a moment he didn't recognize where he was. Then he remembered the hatch, the storm, the frantic scramble for life, and the jars of food that had saved them. The memory steadied him like a hand pressed to his back. They had survived another night. The cabin groaned softly in the morning wind above, but it was still standing still theirs. And yet Jack knew they couldn't stay buried in the cold earth forever. The small stash of food helped, but winter was only beginning. If they wanted to make it through the weeks ahead, they needed more than luck and half-rotten wood. They needed knowledge, real knowledge. The kind Mr. Lewis hinted at, the kind Jack wished he'd learned long before the world broke beneath him. So when the sun lifted, muted and pale behind drifting snow clouds, Jack decided to scout farther from the cabin, not to leave it, but to understand the land around it. He stuffed 2 of the seller's precious jars into his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and whistled for Shadow. The dog bounded up the ladder, First Claw's clicking tail lifted in renewed energy. Jack followed and stepped into a room glazed in thin frost. Snow had blown through the gaps during the night, dusting the floor in uneven patches. It made the cabin feel like a relic abandoned by time, but Jack's heart warmed as Shadow pressed his head against the boy's hip. "We'll make it," Jack whispered, scratching behind the dog's torn ear. "Just stay close." They left the cabin behind and trekked across a slope covered in snow-dusted shrubs. The air felt sharper here, slicing into Jack's lungs with every breath. But something about the stillness gave him courage. He followed Shadow through narrow game trails over fallen logs and across frozen puddles cracking under his boots. After an hour of hiking, the forest thinned into a clearing where the land sloped downward. That's when Jack saw it, a thin ribbon of smoke rising between the trees on the far side of the clearing. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. And people could mean either danger or salvation. Jack felt a cold spike of fear. Shadow sensed it immediately, leaning into Jack's leg with a low, steady sound in his throat that wasn't a growl, more a warning mixed with readiness. Jack crouched behind a boulder, staring at the smoke twisting into the sky like a signal written for someone braver than him. His mind raced through possibilities: hunters, hikers, rangers, someone who might call the police, someone who might hurt them, or someone who might help. The uncertainty coiled tightly in his chest until he forced himself to breathe. He couldn't survive the winter alone. Not like this. Not without help. Finally, he swallowed his fear and whispered, "Come on, Shadow." Slowly. The dog walked ahead, ears, sharp tail, held low but confident, pausing often to glance back and ensure Jack was following. As they drew closer, the shape of another cabin emerged, larger, sturdier, with a roof patched in several places, but clearly maintained by careful hands. Smoke poured from a stone chimney. There were footprints in the snow leading to a shed beside the cabin. Jack's heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears, but before he could decide whether to approach or flee, the door creaked open. An older man stepped onto the porch, squinting into the whiteness. He wore a heavy wool coat, patched at the elbows, thick boots dusted with snow, and a knitted beanie pulled low. But his face was unmistakably weathered, jaw wide and rough with white stubble, nose slightly crooked as if broken long ago, cheekbones sharp, eyes piercing blue, but softened around the edges with the kind of sadness that never quite leaves a person. He looked strong in the way old trees look strong, not because they haven't broken, but because they have, and still stand. His right hand rested instinctively near his belt where a small hunting knife hung. The gesture wasn't threatening, just cautious, the reflex of someone shaped by danger. This was John Parker, though Jack didn't know his name yet. A Vietnam veteran in his early 70s, Parker had lived on the mountain for more than 3 decades. He was a man who sought solitude the way others sought cities because solitude didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, didn't require forgiveness. The war had carved deep trenches into him, not just in scars along his arms and shoulder, but in the way his gaze swept the tree line, always checking, always measuring risk. Shadow stiffened. The dog planted himself between Jack and the stranger, baring his teeth in a low growl that vibrated through the cold air. Parker held up both hands, palms forward, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. "Easy, boy," he said in a voice calm as dry leaves and gravel. "If I wanted trouble, I'd have stayed inside." His gaze shifted to Jack quietly, seriously, and something like recognition flickered there. Not recognition of the boy, but of the fear written across his thin face. Parker let his hands drop slowly. "You look half frozen." Jack's voice refused to work. Shadow's growl deepened. The old man remained still. Then, without a word, Parker turned and disappeared into the cabin, returning moments later with a steaming bowl in his hands. "Stew," he said simply. "Rabbit potatoes a little thyme. I've got more if you want it, both of you." He set the bowl on the porch steps and backed away from it with a gentleness that surprised Jack. No adult had ever tried so hard not to scare him before. Shadow sniffed the air, eyes still trained on the man. Jack crouched, slowly lifted the bowl and tasted a spoonful. Warmth flooded his tongue. Real food. Cooked food. He nearly cried. Shadow ate next, devouring chunks of rabbit with startling hunger. Only when the dog stopped growling did Parker finally approach. "You're not from around here," he said quietly. "Not with those thin shoes." Jack stared at his feet, ashamed. He didn't answer, but that didn't deter Parker. The man let out a long breath as if the weight of old memories pressed against him. "You don't need to tell me anything you don't want to. I'm not here to drag you off this mountain." That was the moment Jack's fear splintered. Not gone completely, fear doesn't vanish so easily, but cracked enough for other things to slip through. Trust, relief, hope. Parker motioned toward the woods. "Come with me. Let's see if we can teach you how to stay alive out here." And so Jack followed him. At first at a distance, then closer as the lesson unfolded. Parker showed him how to read tracks, deer prints, fox prints, even the deep plunging marks of a moose. He demonstrated how to cast a simple line in the creek using nothing but string and a bent nail. He pointed out plants Jack had never noticed before: yarrow for cuts, juniper berries to chew for warmth, pine resin to start fires. Jack listened with the hunger of someone collecting tools for a future no one else believed he had. Parker taught in few words, letting actions speak louder. Jack tried and failed, tried again, and each time Shadow circled them, alert but content, as if recognizing the beginning of something steady and good. By late afternoon, Parker looked at Jack in a way that felt like a quiet decision forming behind his eyes. "Winter is mean up here," he said. "Meaner than anything you've seen. If you don't want to freeze before the month's over, you'd better stay close. Help me with repairs. I'll teach you more tomorrow." Jack nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Parker accepted the answer with a grunt. And that was how a lonely boy, a loyal dog, and an old soldier on a mountain began building a life that none of them expected, but all of them needed. The first hint of danger arrived not as flame, but as scent, a strange sharpness in the sawtooth air that made Shadow stop mid-stride and lift his graying muzzle toward the sky. Jack Carter, now nearly 13, felt the dog's muscles tense beneath his fingers. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the usual chatter of birds replaced by a heavy silence that made Jack's stomach twist. Shadow let out a low rumble, the kind he'd developed over the years when something in the wilderness shifted in ways only an animal could sense. Moments later, John Parker stepped out from behind his cabin, his limp more pronounced than usual. The old veteran wore his heavy canvas coat even though it was early autumn, his broad shoulders stooped, now white beard longer than Jack remembered from last winter. His once sharp blue eyes scanned the horizon with the instincts of a man who had survived more battles than he would ever describe aloud. Parker's voice, gravelly and steady, broke the silence. "Smoke." He pointed his weathered hand toward the southern ridge. A thin, sinister column rose into the pale sky. Jack's chest tightened. The wildfire stories Parker had told him suddenly felt frighteningly real. Shadow huffed anxiously, circling Jack like a shepherd protecting his last sheep. The fire grew faster than either Jack or Parker anticipated. Afternoon wind gusts whipped the column sideways, sending sparks into dry brush miles ahead. By sunset, the sky had turned the color of bruised peach, and ash fell lightly like the first snow. Parker moved with the efficiency of an old soldier, reverting to reflex, wetting blankets, digging defensive lines, filling buckets, packing what they could carry. Even in the chaos, his voice remained calm, giving instructions without wasting a breath. Jack, now stronger, broader-shouldered and more capable than the terrified boy who once arrived on the mountain mirrored Parker's pace. Shadow darted back and forth, sniffing trails, growling at the wind's shifting heat, never leaving Jack's side. When embers began falling into their clearing, hissing as they landed on pine needles, Parker made the call. "We leave. Now." His tone brokered no argument. Jack grabbed his pack, Shadow's small emergency harness, and Parker's old first aid satchel. The three of them moved northward, following a steep trail toward the rocky outcrop Parker had shown Jack years earlier, a natural fortress of granite overlooking a deep, cold lake. The climb was brutal. Smoke thickened the air, turning every breath into fire. Jack's eyes stung, his lungs burned, and Shadow coughed in wheezing barks. Parker moved slower, the years weighing heavily on each step. His broad frame shook with the effort, but he pushed onward, jaw clenched, refusing to let his body betray them. By the time they reached the outcrop, night had swallowed the mountain. Below them, firelight flickered like a monstrous heartbeat, devouring ridges and pine crowns with terrifying ease. Jack soaked cloths from the lake to cover their mouths. Shadow pressed against him, trembling. Parker sat on a boulder, sweat matting his white hair, his hand trembling not from fear, but exhaustion. Jack knelt beside him. "We'll be okay," he whispered, echoing the words Parker had given him countless times. Parker nodded weakly. The old soldier's eyes reflected the blaze below, and for a moment Jack wondered if Parker was reliving some long-buried battlefield of a different war. The trio spent the night in shifts. Jack kept watch while Parker rested. Then Parker, though barely able to stand, insisted on taking a turn so Jack could sleep. Shadow never slept at all, pacing between them like a sentry until his paws gave out and he lay beside Jack, sides heaving. Dawn came cold and gray. The smoke had thinned. The roar had softened. And when they descended the mountain, stepping cautiously toward their clearing, Jack's heart thudded so loudly it drowned out all other sounds. Miraculously, perhaps by luck, perhaps by the firebreak Parker taught Jack to build, the two cabins still stood. Trees around them were blackened, the garden singed, and the shed scorched, but the homes themselves remained. Jack fell to his knees in relief, arms wrapping around Shadow as the dog whimpered with exhaustion and joy. Parker exhaled deeply, closing his eyes. "The mountain gave us mercy," he murmured. But mercy from fire could not change what time had quietly been stealing. Years passed in a rhythm shaped by seasons, Jack hunting, fishing, planting. Parker teaching, advising, and resting more with each winter. Shadow aging with dignified grace. Jack grew into a lean, sharp-eyed young man, tanned by sun, hardened by work, quick with his hands, and even quicker in reading the forest's moods. At 15, he carried himself with steady confidence, the kind born from survival loss and quiet victories. John Parker's health, however, continued its slow surrender. His once strong gait became uncertain. His hands, gnarled by arthritis and old injuries, shook more often, forcing Jack to take over tasks like splitting logs and setting traps. But the old veteran never complained. He guided Jack with soft words, never admitting how much he had come to depend on the boy. One frost-silvered morning, as thin sunlight pushed through the treetops, Jack walked to Parker's cabin carrying fresh-cut firewood. Shadow trotted beside him now, a senior dog with a muzzle dusted white and slower steps but still devoted. Jack knocked lightly, then pushed the door open. Parker lay in bed, hands folded over his chest, face peaceful in a way Jack had never seen before, free from the shadows that had haunted him for decades. When Jack touched the old man's wrist, the truth hit with a quiet, devastating finality. Jack buried John Parker on the very ridge where they had once watched the wildfires advance. He carved a wooden marker, smoothing it with trembling fingers. Shadow lay beside the grave, head bowed. The wind carried the scent of pine and memory. Months later, age caught up with Shadow too. His legs weakened. His breaths grew shallow. One golden afternoon, the dog walked slowly to the base of the tallest pine, his favorite shade in summer, and lay down with deliberate calm. Jack knelt beside him, pressing his forehead to Shadow's. The dog's eyes, still soulful, though clouded with age, held gratitude, loyalty, and a quiet farewell. Shadow exhaled softly and went still. Jack buried him beneath the pine, marking the grave with stones he gathered by hand. Grief shaped Jack, but it did not crush him. The mountain had taught him how to bend without breaking. By the time he turned 15, Jack Carter had become a legend, whispered in Boise, a wild, capable teenager who lived along the ridges of Sawtooth with skills that rivaled seasoned woodsmen. He walked between two cabins that had saved his life, the forgotten one he claimed as a boy and Parker's cabin, now his, by inheritance and memory. Each structure held a piece of his story: fear, survival guidance, loss, and rebirth. And standing between them one sunset with the forest washed in gold, Jack understood something powerful. The mountain had not just kept him alive. It had remade him free, resilient, and unbreakable. In the end, Jack Carter's journey wasn't just about survival. It was a quiet reminder that even in our darkest moments, something greater is at work. Some call it fate. Others call it a miracle. And many believe it is God's gentle hand guiding us through storms we were never meant to face alone. Jack found family in a stranger purpose in the wilderness and love in the loyalty of a dog. But more than anything, he found proof that where there is courage, God plants a path. Where there is loneliness, he sends companionship. And where there is loss, he offers the strength to rise again. As you go back to your own life, your home, your daily routines, your quiet battles, remember this: miracles rarely arrive with thunder. Most come as small mercies, hidden helpers, and moments of unexpected grace. Just like they did for Jack. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what part spoke to you the most. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of resilience, faith, and the quiet ways God moves through our lives. May the Lord watch over you tonight. May He bless your home, your family, and the road ahead. And may His gentle miracles find you exactly when you need them most. God bless you.